We're here at Sarah. We just arrived yesterday, early morning. And so now we're in quarantine for 2 weeks. So when I signed up to teach this course, I did not know what would be happening. But as it happened, we ended up being able to leave Nepal very quickly. So we're here at Sarah. So actually, I had thought to kind of introduce things this way by explaining a little bit about our situation. Because I think this situation of the year for us, it illustrates the value of relying on a guru, the blessings of the guru. This has been quite an extraordinary year for us. So actually, I happened to have the fortune to meet with the Lama Zopa Rinpoche last year in January. I asked him, where I should do retreat. They did a mo, and very quickly he had a broad smile on his face, and he said, "You go to Mahayana." So I decided to do that. I made plans to leave fairly quickly for Mahayana, which is in the east of Nepal, very isolated area, and did retreat until April. And when I came out of retreat, the world was in lockdown. I hadn't known about that, so I was a bit shocked. I think I explained this before, if any of you here, for the last teaching. But of course, the story went on. So I was in Mahayana for 7 months up until September. She also told him to go to Mahayana. And we were at Kopan from September 24th to December 24th, exactly 3 months. So at the beginning of December, then Sarah, our monastery, announced to us that you have to come back immediately for your exam, which was a bit of a shock for us. And we couldn't get back. We had no way to get back to India from Nepal. So we had to be back, for the exam, but also had to be back in time to quarantine before the exam. So we couldn't just come back the day before the exam. So we were trying all kinds of methods to get back to India. And actually, we had even considered the last ditch option was going to be that we would fly to the US and then fly back to India immediately, which would be dangerous and tiring because we weren't allowed in any other country. And there was no way to fly from Nepal to India or cross the border with our visas, American passports, actually. But then things moved slowly, and then very quickly. And we tried to get on a plane with Nepal Airlines when they opened. They wouldn't let us on the plane. We tried to get on a plane with Air India. They wouldn't let us on the plane. But then we happened to get connected with somebody very high up in the Indian embassy who connected us. And within 3 days, we were able to get on a plane. But even that was a lot of hassle. We almost got turned away at the airport and finally got on the flight. And even some more hassle inside the airport, but we did get on the flight and made it to India just on Christmas Eve, just as Christmas was coming around, our Christmas gift. Pretty much exactly the last day we could have possibly gotten here in order to finish our quarantine in time for the exam, which is going to be in a few weeks. All this time, we were fortunate to be at Kopan with Rinpoche, and Rinpoche never seemed too concerned about it, but he just said, keep waiting and see. I can't say the story is over yet because now we're get sick. We've been traveling, but let's see. But I think, as I say, this, for us, illustrates the importance of following the Guru's advice, even though it doesn't seem to make sense at the time, and slow obstacles. So with that said, here we are for our course. So I taught a course on 70 Stanzas on Emptiness by Nagarjuna actually exactly 1 month ago. And I said I would hopefully teach some other courses on Nagarjuna's other short works. So we have now the 60 Stanzas on reasoning. which is one of the other of the sixfold collection of reasoning, which I'll actually explain as part of the talk. So I think to begin, I think Shanti had some prayers we can load onto the screen. We can do some prayers together, and then we can start the actual course. So Shanti, do you have the prayers ready to load up? Okay, so let's begin with these prayers. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and humans, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings. To you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. When I was supreme among humans, you were born on this earth. You paced out 7 strides and then said, I am supreme. Maybe can we scroll down, Shanti? Okay. I am supreme in this world. To you who are the wise went, then I prostrate. With pure bodies, formed supremely pure, wisdom motion like a golden mountain, fame that blazes in the 3 worlds, winner of the best, Lord, to you I prostrate. With the supreme signs, face like spotless moon, color like gold, to you I prostrate. Dust free like you, the 3 worlds are not, incomparably wise one, to you I prostrate. The Savior having great compassion, the Founder having all understanding, the field of merit with the qualities like a vast ocean, to you, the one gone to thusness, I prostrate. And the purity that frees one from attachment, the virtue that frees one from the lower realms, supreme, excellent, sublime Dharma. Maybe scroll down again, Shanti. Shanti, if you're here, please scroll down. Okay. To the Dharma that pacifies, I prostrate. Those who are liberated and who also show the path to liberation, the holy field qualified with realizations, who are devoted to the moral precepts, to you, the sublime community intending virtue, I prostrate. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all 3 ever devote homage. To all worthy of respect, bound with the bodies as many as all realms, atoms, and all. Do not commit any non-virtuous action, formally perfect virtuous actions. Okay, scroll down again, please. Subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. To Ahmed, yes, so now next page, please. A star and a visual aberration, a lamp, flame of a lamp, an illusion, dew, bubble, a dream, a flash, lightning, or a cloud, see conditioned things as such. Through these merits may sentient beings attain the rank of all-seeing, subdue the 4 faults, and be libered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. I prostrate to the Arya Triple Gem. Thus did I hear at one time, the Bhagavan was dwelling in massive Vulture's mountain, in Rajagriha together with a great community of monks and great community of bodhisattvas. Okay, scroll down again, please. At that time, the Bhagavan was absorbed in the profound concentration of the categories of phenomena called profound illumination. Also at that time, the Venerable Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva Aryavalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty and of inherent nature. Then through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Aryavalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Aryavalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Shariputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should, to scroll down again, please. Should perfectly look upon the five yeah. Look at it, yeah. We should. Okay, needs next page, please. Form is empty, emptiness is form. Emptiness. We should look upon it like this: correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates, all see as empty of inherent nature. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is not other than emptiness. Likewise, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness are empty. So next page, please. Phenomena emptiness without characteristic, without production, unproduced, unseized, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness, there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so up to including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, and up to including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. There is no, so next page, please.
Hello, just a moment, everyone. Hello, everyone. I request you all to mute your videos. I apologize for the slight problem. Venerable is in quarantine, and also there's another problem that I did the security settings a little wrong. It should be fine now. So please stop your videos and mute your audios. We'll be back soon. Class has just started.
Okay.
Hello, Venerable.
If we
Yes.
can reload it, otherwise technicalities reload. Okay, so let's just we start from the heart chakra. Tayata om gate gate paragate to om gate gate paragate parasam gate bodhisoha gate bodhisoha. And we can just recite the refuge prayer. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. From the merits I create by my practice of teaching the Dharma, and you all say listening to the Dharma, may I attain Buddhahood to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. With the merits created by my practice of giving other perfections, may I attain my practice of teaching the Dharma, may I attain the state of a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. The merits created by my practice of teaching the Dharma may attain the state of a Buddha to benefit all migrating beings. So we can just do the mandala offering briefly also. Saji Bugi Jugjing Meido Ramri Rahabling Jing Nidegam Paling Sangye Jingdo Mite Buwagi Rugunam Jingla Chubajo Idam Gurna Mandala Kamnerya Tayami. Okay, so let's just sit quietly for a couple of minutes. There's no bandwidth required for that. And then, well, you can get centered. I think I need to get centered here. And then we can start with the actual course, just for a couple of minutes. Okay, so we'll get started now. Now, if we get cut off again, actually, maybe you can use that opportunity to sit silently again. It's good to periodically have small breaks so that we can process the material and not get too caught up in ideas. So we'll do the best we can. We're here at the Tashi Chöling Center at Sergey, which is where we're having the quarantine. And the connection is quite poor here. It's actually quite a bit better other places, the monastery. But because the monastery is built on two hills, then it depends where you are, up or down the hill, depending on how close you are to a tower. So welcome everybody. I think maybe some of you were here from my course a month ago on the 70 stanzas. Although I looked at the list and it seemed like there were quite a very different people this time. I think a few of you were here last time. Seems like there's quite a bit more Indians this time than there were last time. I'm not sure. I thought maybe people in the West were on holiday for Christmas break, so maybe that's why. So if any of you were here from my last course, the 70 stanzas and emptiness, you probably recognize that it was quite a difficult text. 70 stanzas and emptiness is, as it says, a text about emptiness. It's quite confusing. Nagarjuna's main topic of any of his texts really is emptiness. But some of his texts are more practical than others. And the 60 stanzas and reasoning, although it has a very similar name, 60 stanzas, 70 stanzas, it's a very different text. It is focused more on the practical aspects of emptiness, what it means to meditate on emptiness, what it means to realize it, and what it means to be enlightened. Why is it that we need to meditate on emptiness? So I'll explain more about that as we get into the actual discussion. So I will load now the presentation, if I can find it here. A moment. Okay, here we have it. Okay, I hope you can all see I should also mention if and also won't be able to see your faces if okay, 60 stanzas on reasoning. We were here last time, but only the first couple. After that, it should be new. You might know about Nalanda University, which University So I don't know if I said, oh, it's the university. the first millennium AD or CE. This was the largest university in the world. To Greece, so at least in the Eastern Hemisphere, a lot of different able to hear. So hopefully it will come through. Two main streams of Buddhism. The Pali tradition is more based on transmitting an authentic tradition, meaning that the teacher teaches the student who then passes it on without making much change to it. Whereas the Sanskrit tradition is much more based on debate and reasoning. So it's not just about accepting things because the teacher said so, but about questioning and thinking outside the box, thinking about new ways of understanding. And this also can mean thereby engaging with different disciplines. So in ancient India, this meant engaging with Hinduism and engaging with the Vedic traditions, also engaging with logic and other sciences that were extant at the time. And nowadays, that could mean engaging with other disciplines like philosophy, psychology, and science. And the idea here is that this is actually useful for developing compassion. That if we just to meditate, as our teacher has instructed us, but if we really want to be able to the entire world, it's important to understand the different disciplines that are important in the world that people take. So this you'll see is the approach that we'll take here about how Buddhism relates to other religious traditions, as you'll see. So we have here Nagarjuna, who lived sometime in the very vague exactly when he lived. Historical records were not very well kept in India. What we have are his philosophical tone very clearly, with a great commentarial tradition, but we do not have a lot of historical information about that. He probably taught at Nalanda. Doesn't mean that the university in Nalanda was necessarily there at the time, but the place, Nalanda, was actually a place. And so Nagarjuna also, it seems, may have been there with his student Aryadeva teaching. He's considered one of the two great charioteers, the founder of the middle, and the other one being the Chittamatra, or mind-only school. Okay, so yeah. Okay, so if you all have the screen, next time, if it becomes a problem again, I won't share the screen again. And if you all have the how do you say, if you all have the presentation, you can scroll down yourself and I'll mention which slide we're on. But let's see for now. So the other one was the mind-only school founded by a Sangha, the other great charioteer. I have mentioned here the Nagarjuna in context. It's a text. If you're interested in Nagarjuna, this is the best one that I've seen. It's actually by my college professor, Joseph Walzer. So if you're interested in that, I won't get into too much to any of the historical details. So Nagarjuna had the sixfold collection of reasoning now. He had actually four collection of reasoning, collection of praises, which he praises to the Buddha, which includes, some of you might know the text, Letter to a Friend, well known of those. And then the collection of scriptural quotation, sutras, trying to demonstrate that the Buddha had taught emptiness in the sutras. These are where he actually uses reasoning to try to establish emptiness. And these are also divided into three different sections. So the first, we have two texts negating inherent existence. First of all, root wisdom of the mystics text. This is also the longest of the text. It negates inherent existence directly. Whereas the text finally, 6 pages, negates the arguments. So rather than negating the subject of the arguments, it has 16 different. We have two texts affirming conventionality, so it's eventually they can function. So one of these is the studies in general, and this is that digression from chapter 7 of Root Wisdom. And then we have the speller of the arguments can still negate wrong views. So not just in general, but specifically arguments, although they do not exist ultimately, they can conventionally negate wrong views. This is a digression from chapter 1 of Root Wisdom. And finally, we have two, mind realizing emptiness brings liberation. The 60 stanzas on reasoning, which I'll teach now. Okay, so let's stop the screen sharing, and then we can, everyone can load it onto their own screen. Shanti, have you sent it? Sure, I know that everyone has this text, the PDF file.
Venerable, everyone doesn't have the PDF, but I'm sending it to them.
You can scroll down on your own. Okay, yeah, so Shanti will send it out, and I'll just keep talking and explain to you what's being shown, and hopefully you'll receive it soon on your email. So 60 stanzas on reasoning, it shows how even Hinayana practitioners, meaning practitioners of the individual liberation vehicle, must realize emptiness to attain liberation. Whereas Precious Garland shows how Mahayana practitioners meditate in emptiness. So it's more extensive. It shows the Mahayana path. Precious Garland is also a very long text. It's about 75 pages. It's showing that the entire Mahayana path. So unlike the other of the sixfold collection, it is more it is more about the method side, although it does have teachings on emptiness. Whereas 60 stanzas in reasoning is mostly about emptiness, but not about the Mahayana path. It's more, the point of this text is showing that even if somebody wishes to achieve individual liberation, they must realize emptiness. That's really the most important subject that I'll be talking about here. So the next slide, again, if you don't see it yet, it says it's just 60 stanzas in reasoning. And I mentioned that there are 3 main commentaries on this text that we are basing this discussion on. There are actually many commentaries, but in the Geluk school, we use 3 main ones. One is Chandrakirti's commentary. Chandrakirti was one of the greatest expositors of Nagarjuna's thought in Tibet, especially in the Gaelic school. We especially rely on his commentaries. And his commentary on 60 stanzas of reasoning is one of his 4 main texts, we usually say. The other ones being his commentary on root wisdom, which is called the Clear Words, his text called Supplement to the Middle Way, or also Entering the Middle Way is another way to translate it, which is also a commentary on root wisdom, but rather than being a word for word commentary, it is trying to get at the meaning. So it doesn't actually go through word by word, but just talks about the meaning in a more extensive way. And then also his text of the commentary on the 400 stanzas by Aryadeva. So that, along with his commentary on 60 stanzas, are his 4 main texts. And then we have Gyaltsab Je's notes on Je Tsongkhapa's teaching. So Tsongkhapa gave a oral teaching in public about the 60 stanzas, and Gyaltsab Je, one of his main students, took notes on it. And we just have those notes. And then finally, we have Gyaltsab Je's own commentary, which, based on those notes, he made a more extensive commentary, which is definitely the clearest. So most of what I will talk about will be based on Gyaltsab Je's commentary. Gyaltsab Je is really renowned for the clarity of his commentaries. He wrote commentaries on a lot of Indian texts, kind of clarifying what the terse verses mean. And actually, all of his texts are pretty much Tsongkhapa's teachings. It's authored by Gyaltsab Je, but it's really that Tsongkhapa kind of gave him the idea of what to say, and he just put it into a textual form. So we can consider this to be Tsongkhapa's teaching. Now, Gyaltsab Je, or Gyaltsab Dhamma is his full name, he says, the purpose of this text, the 60 stanzas, is to prove to hearers, meaning the Hinayana practitioners, that emptiness is the meaning of their own sutras. So this is a controversial point. Some people might say, for example, followers of the Pali tradition might say that emptiness is a Mahayana teaching and it's not part of the original early teachings of the Buddha. But the purpose of this text is to show that when the Buddha taught things like the Four Noble Truths, he was actually talking about emptiness, even though it wasn't explained as explicitly or as clearly as it was in the Mahayana Sutras. And therefore, anybody who achieved arhatship or liberation based on these texts, which we see many people of the Buddha's early disciples, such as Sariputra and Margalana, his main 2 disciples, achieved liberation. And so the point here is that if they did achieve liberation, they must have realized emptiness. It's not possible to achieve liberation without realizing emptiness. So even though the wording might not have clearly expounded emptiness, that's what was being talked about, and that's what people understood. So then I want to step back, and here we have the topic of this first discussion will be, what is enlightenment? Because this is what Nagarjuna is getting at. He's saying that anybody who claims to be enlightened has to have realized emptiness, even if they don't use those words, which is an important point. But if somebody doesn't realize emptiness, they can't be enlightened. They might think they are, and we might have examples in the Buddha's lifetime of his own teachers, Alara Kamara and Udraka Ramaputra. You might know that he took teachings from these early masters who claimed to be enlightened, but the Buddha himself said, actually, I've realized this person's teaching, I've gone to the end of it, but it's not enlightenment. It's merely a state of concentration. So somebody might think they're enlightened, but that doesn't necessarily mean they are. To really be enlightened, somebody has to realize emptiness. So I want to look at this, though, because then we have a question, well, is enlightenment something that's exclusive to Buddhism? And then within Buddhism, it's something exclusive only to one kind of Buddhism or not? And that's a difficult question. I think I'm going to be giving actually more questions and answers here. But I want to show that this is an important question and show that there are different avenues for exploring this. But I think I want to start with a message from Nagarjuna himself, that this question of enlightenment is not just an abstract philosophical concept. This is an urgent matter. So Nagarjuna says in his letter to a friend, your head or clothes might suddenly catch fire, and desperately you tried to put it out. More so, seek means to sever further birth. There's no more pressing urgency than that. So he's saying that if anybody has the pictures here, you'll see the picture of the man on fire. It's quite a grotesque picture. This is Nagarjuna's comparing our situation. Our situation being born in samsara is urgent. It's an emergency. We're being born continuously through the power of karma beyond our control and experiencing suffering. And so we want to get enlightened, not just because we want to be able to have something interesting to say or have the right philosophical answer, but because we want to be free of suffering. So whether or not we have to realize emptiness to become enlightened becomes a very important question. How do we put out this fire? Also, can anybody let me know? Just let me know if everybody has the slides now, so just that I know whether everyone is able to see what I'm talking about. In any case, I'll keep describing them as I go along. So this is a quote from Dharmakirti, another great Indian master, saying that we cause it, we can end it, this meaning samsara. So Dharmakirti says, out of attachment to myself, without somebody forcing me, pursuing bliss, avoiding pain, I take on an inferior birth. So he's saying that what's causing me to be born is not somebody else forcing me. It's not like God causes me to be born, or anybody else is forcing me to be born in any way. It's out of my own attachment. We attach to what we consider happiness, and we avoid what we consider pain. And doing that the habitual energy of that propels further birth. So I have the picture here of a fish going after a hook. It looks very tasty to us, but it's actually a trap. This is the trap of samsara. And then the next verse says, this suffering comes from wayward minds. By cravings, noose is tightly bound. Whatever being is free of those will not again experience birth. So the cause of this suffering is wayward minds, meaning wrong views of how things exist. And it's bound by the noose of craving. So the immediate cause is craving, but the underlying cause of craving is this wayward minds, or these wrong views that we have. Okay, so we are downloading, I see. So somebody asked the question, isn't right view of emptiness? So I'll just say quickly, yes, that right view means the view of emptiness. And this is part of what, when we talk about in the Pali Canon, when the Buddha says we need to have the right view, Nagarjuna understands this to mean we need to have the view of emptiness. So then Nagarjuna says in two of his other texts that the only solution is to realize emptiness. First, he has his commentary in Bodhicitta. Those who don't know emptiness cannot be liberation's base, meaning they cannot be ones who will achieve enlightenment or liberation. Confused ones cycle through 6 realms within the prison of this world. So you'll see I have a picture here. Again, if anyone misses anything, just type it in the chat. So in his praise for the transcendent one, he says, not realizing timelessness, no liberation comes, you said. You, being the Buddha, said this. So in the Mahayana text, you taught this in entirety. So timelessness here is another way of understanding emptiness. So it's basically saying without realizing emptiness, you cannot achieve liberation. And then in the Mahayana text, you taught this in its entirety, meaning that although the Buddha did teach emptiness in the Hinayana Sutras, the first turning of the wheel, he taught it more extensively in the Mahayana. So that's the distinction. Although he taught it in the Hinayana, that's the important thing. But the only difference is not that he didn't teach it in Hinayana, but in the Mahayana, he taught it more clearly. Because in order to achieve full enlightenment of a Buddha, we need not only to realize emptiness in a narrow way, we need to realize it in a more broad sense. And I'll talk about what that means in a little while. But basically, the point is that the real object of realization is the same. It's a matter of meditating on it longer and using more different lines of reasoning. But the understanding, the fundamental understanding, is the same. So next we have the be careful not to denigrate others. So this, okay. Be careful not to denigrate others. So this is a very important point. I said that we need to realize emptiness to achieve liberation, and that somebody who hasn't realized emptiness hasn't achieved liberation. But how do we know if somebody else really has or not? So first of all, we have Gache, the other great disciple of Tsongkhapa other than Gyaltsab, who said in his text, Dose of Emptiness, when we point out flaws in the hearer's philosophical systems, do not think that we are implying that individual hearer practitioners do not realize emptiness. Do not denigrate the hearer vehicle. Do not denigrate the teachings of the Buddha. So the point here is that you'll see a lot of times in the texts of the Madhyamaka school, them pointing out flaws and saying that we say basically the Vaibhashika, the Great Exposition school, and the Sautrantrika, the sutra following school, that they're wrong, that they have a wrong view of the Buddhist teachings. So somebody might take this to think that it's saying that all the people who are practicing the Hinayana teachings are wrong. But the point here is that we're not understanding what the Buddha was actually talking about. So that's not saying that the hearer vehicle, the teachings that the Buddha gave in the first turning of the wheel were wrong. It's saying that somebody was misinterpreting what he said. So do not denigrate the teachings, do not denigrate the true practitioners. Somebody might actually practice these teachings and achieve liberation if they understand them properly. And likewise, the Buddha himself said, denigrates himself. So this is good advice in general, that we never really know some in their mind, so we shouldn't assume that we do. It doesn't mean we should never criticize people if somebody's doing something wrong, but we have to be very careful to distinguish and say, okay, this is a wrong action, without just immediately jumping to the conclusion, this is a bad person. Okay, the next slide we have. Also, like on a similar note, I have a quote by Lama Zopa Rinpoche, which I think is very relevant, and I'll come back to this later. Lama Zopa Rinpoche said this, I didn't actually hear him say it directly, but again, Tenzin Lexok, the director of our house here, Sarah, he reported this to me, which I think was a very important thing. He said, before Lama Tsongkhapa, nobody in Tibet was able to provide an accurate philosophical exposition of emptiness. Does that mean that before Lama Tsongkhapa, nobody realized emptiness? No, it doesn't mean that. If somebody has sufficient merit, they will realize emptiness. So this shows that whether or not we realize emptiness, although it is important to have the right philosophical view because it will help, really what's just as important, and in some sense even more important, is to have a great accumulation of merit. And this then opens the possibility that people from other schools other than our own, and that's a big question, about with people in other religions, whether they might be experiencing this simply based on their level of merit. So the understanding here, at least according to the Gillick school, certain other scholars might have the wrong view or might not be able to present things in a correct philosophical way. So a great example of this would be Milarepa. Didn't have a scholarly understanding of emptiness, but had a realization of emptiness, mainly due to his devotion to his teacher and the merit accumulated to that. Now, then the question is, well, what's the point of studying about it? Now, the point here is that, generally speaking, it's a lot easier to realize it if we understand it properly, what he calls the general teachings for the. So there might be a very pithy instruction that's effective for helping one person at a particular time, but for other people, it might be very esoteric. So generally speaking, thinking about things in a more philosophical sense is very helpful, because most of us are not at the point where just a single word or action will cause us to realize emptiness. We need to really think about this. It's like having a proper roadmap. You can get to the right place without the right roadmap, but it's a lot easier to get there if you have the right map. So next we have the Buddha's own teaching. Some of you might know the Buddha saying, the finger is not the moon. You might have heard this teaching. What this means is that, the Buddha said that when I teach, it's like a finger pointing to the moon being the truth of things. And in this case, we're talking about the understanding of emptiness. But the teaching itself is just a finger. It's just something pointing to that. So if we get too attached to the words as the ultimate truth, then we're missing the point. It's like if somebody points to the moon and we just look at their finger. We're not trying to look at their finger. We're trying to look at what they're pointing at. So I think, in terms of Buddhism, personally for me, having come to Buddhism from outside, not being born into this culture, Buddhism is something that gives us a paradigm for understanding reality. This is why we come to it, because we're confused about the way things exist and what's the cause of happiness and what's the cause of suffering. And Buddhism has a very good paradigm for that. But it's important to understand that it's a paradigm. It doesn't necessarily mean that it has the answer to everything. The world is a very different place now than it was 2,500 years ago. And we have a lot more access to a lot of different teachings, a lot more evidence to draw on. And so a lot of the questions that we ask might even be different questions. So we need to use that paradigm in an effective way, but also be open to the possibility that there could be other ways of seeing things which are valid based on different perspectives. I think in our culture is very egalitarian, which generally is a good thing. There are sometimes some problems with that, but I think generally speaking, this is a very helpful way to open our minds. Not think that there's only one way to see things. We have to be careful not to go to the extreme. I think there's two extremes that we can go to. One is if we just say that Buddhism is right and everything else is wrong. But I think that's much too extreme, especially because what is the question we're even asking? So it would be like if I, for example, found the cure for cancer, which would be an extraordinary legal system. And I just insisted, well, I have the cure for cancer. I know the answer. But it's a different question we're asking. We're not asking how to cure cancer. We're asking how to make a just legal system. So I think when we look at different religions, oftentimes that's the case. When we look at a religion like Islam and we look at the life of the Prophet Muhammad, the questions that he was asking and the context in which he was asking them were very different than the context in which the Buddha was living and the questions he was asking. So it's impossible to say one person was right, one was wrong, because they were asking very different questions. And thereby coming up with what were useful answers that only Buddhism is right. But then I think the other extreme that sometimes we might go to is to say that thereby all religions say the exact same thing. We have this finger in the moon, which again, I think is a little too extreme. It may be the case, I really don't this comes back to what we said about religions are also enlightened. But we also have to look at what we can see and then thereby think about, well, how do we practice personally? Now, His Holiness the Dalai Lama has made the point that in other religions, especially in Western religions, there's no talk about liberation. There's no talk about being trapped in samsara, in the cycle of existence, and thereby freeing the mind from afflictions and being liberated from that. So how can we expect that that's what the religion is actually about if it's not what it's saying? It doesn't mean that it's wrong or that it's useless, but the point is that the question is specifically, does it lead to liberation? And that's a difficult question, but I think, generally speaking, this is personally why I've come to Buddhism, is it seems that Buddhism is much more clear about how to do that. It may be that certain exceptional people within other religions are having experiences of emptiness or even liberation. I'm not sure, and I'll talk about that in this talk. But certainly, it's not the main thrust of the religion. It's not what the teachings are explicitly saying. And that is a more difficult question when we talk about other Indian religions. Other Indian religions do talk about samsara and about liberation. But among these two extremes, I think I'd probably personally, if I had to lean a little more to the other, I'd lean a little more to the second one. That I think that a lot of religions are pointing to something very profound. I can't say it's the same or not, but I think that we have to think about human beings are the same everywhere. And people are trying to be free of suffering, and certain exceptional people might be finding some avenue towards that, whether it's put in very different language or very different philosophical context. I think I lean more to talking about, rather than the extreme of only one is right and the other are wrong. But I think in every situation, we have to be very careful. I say it sort of at each individual point, and not just make blanket statements about if this is saying this. And even within Buddhist traditions, I think it would definitely be extreme to say that only Tibetan Buddhists or even only Geluks are enlightened. That would be, I think, basically a sectarian position. I don't think that's correct. And even in this very text, as I mentioned, Nagarjuna is saying very clearly that even Hinayana practitioners achieve liberation. But at the same time, I personally have chosen Tibetan Buddhism as my path because I think that when we look at the transmission of Buddhism from India, a lot more of the teachings were transmitted to Tibet. So even within countries that practice Mahayana, we have China, mainly China and Tibet, and then there's the other countries that, with China, there's also Korea and Vietnam and Japan, which were heavily influenced by China. And in Tibet, we have Mongolia, Ladakh, other countries in the Tibetan sphere. But generally speaking, we can distinguish Tibetan and Chinese systems. And even in China, the level of development of scholarship was much less. This had to do a lot with the political system. That in Tibet, there was heavy support by the royalty that sponsored the translation of texts and the continual generation to generation, the continual building of universities and so forth. Whereas in China, it was much less stable. Because for one thing, Buddhism was not the only religion. There was also Taoism and Confucianism, which were competing for royal support, but also there were oftentimes persecutions where almost all of the universities in China would be destroyed, and then they had to rebuild. So the continuation of the scholarship was not as strong. Now, again, it doesn't mean that individual people were not having incredible realization. The Landa tradition that I talked about before, it does seem that in Tibet, it had the most stable continuation of that. So now I want to talk about, individual religions, and just briefly, as I said, I think I will be raising more questions than I'll be providing answers. But I think it's useful just to think about them in the context of what Nagarjuna has said about the importance of realizing emptiness. Okay. So first we have Western religious traditions. You see, I have mainly the three great Western religious traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And you see, I have pictures of books because these are generally, these religions are called the people of the book, and they're very heavily based on these scriptures. And as I said, what kind of question context religions were based on what was called scripture by some. We have, again, one way of it would be to say that these traditions believe that there was a creator God who, because there's no creator God, or that it was some kind of worldly God, as we say in Buddhism. Again, I think it's subtler than that. I don't think we can so easily dismiss it. When we look at the lives of these people, and actually, especially when we look at the life of the Prophet Muhammad, because this is one of which we have the most information. Yeah, I'm back again. Again, please just leave messages in the chat if you're missing parts of my presentation. I'm just going to continue talking where I left off. I'm not sure exactly when I was cut off, but I was just saying that I think it's more subtle. We cannot just say about these traditions that they were based on wrong teachings or that the people were fabricating a creator God. It does seem to me that the people who are essentially acting as mediums, we would say, transmitting teachings from some kind of source beyond the human realm, that there was something very real going on here. And I was specifically talking about the Prophet Muhammad because we have the most information about his life. It's quite extraordinary what happened in his life. And it definitely seems that he was connected with some kind of force beyond himself. Whether we want to say that was a worldly God, I really don't have the answer. But I think personally, my sense from reading about his biography and reading his history of Islam is that there was something deeper than that. Whether it was conceptualized in one way, this comes back to what Gache was saying, that people who make philosophical systems based upon these revelations might make errors and make philosophical systems that don't stand up to debate. But the people who are actually having the experiences, they might have really been having some kind of profound experience. And I think if we look at the history of a lot of the great masters of the Western religious traditions, and that's in the next slide we have here, Western religious masters, we see that there were people who were practicing and having some kind of realization. So first of all, in Judaism, we have the great rabbis. For example, Rabbi Hillel, you see I'll have here, who was a contemporary or lived a little bit before Jesus Christ. In this time in Judaism, when there were many different sects within the tradition, and some of these people were really seriously practicing, trying to not just make philosophies, but understand how do we experience God directly. And then especially in the Christian tradition, we see what we would call in India, we would call yogis, people who were meditating. So the early of this were what we call the Desert Fathers. Some of you might know. When there was in about the 2nd and 3rd, 4th centuries in the Christian sphere, there was a lot of debate about who was Jesus and what was his message, and a lot of argument, especially in Alexandria in Egypt, was a hotspot for this. And some people decided that they were not satisfied just to be arguing with each other, and they wanted to see if they could experience this directly. And so they went out into the desert to meditate in very harsh conditions. And one of the greatest of these was, we have here Saint Anthony, who I think at age 25 entered into solitary retreat for 30 years, up until age 55. And then he would say, revelation, and then taught the remainder of his life, which was a long time. He lived to be 105 years old, so taught for 50 years. And he's often considered one of the fathers of Western monasticism. So what he really experienced, it's hard to say. These desert fathers were notorious for not really talking about their experience. They were more talking about practical aspects of the monastic life. Now, a lot of you might know that in Western religion, in Christianity specifically, that early Christianity was one church, but gradually it split into various different churches. And especially one of the major splits occurred, I think, in 1054 AD, between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Western Roman or Catholic Church. And then later, the Catholic Church also split into Protestantism. So for my examination, I feel that of these three, the Orthodox, the Catholic, and the Protestant, which are the main Christian traditions, there are also others, but these are the largest ones, that the Orthodox Eastern Church is the one that is kept the strongest level of meditative practice. Generally, in a very broad sense, it would seem that it was in the Eastern Church that there was the idea that it's possible to become like Jesus. This isn't just somebody that we pray to that saves us. It's somebody that we have to emulate personally. Whereas in the Catholic Church, although there is an idea that certain people can be saints, that they can be more extraordinary than other people, it's understood more that this is just the blessing of God or the blessing of the Holy Spirit or Jesus. It's not something that can just come through effort. And then in Protestantism, it's even stronger, that it's not even possible, that anybody who thinks that they're elevated is wrong. And Martin Luther himself was very explicit about that. But in the Eastern Church, there was maintained the idea that certain extraordinary people who really put effort into it, can experience some kind of illumination. And one of the greatest of these you see here is Saint Seraphim, who was a Russian master in the late 18th century, early 19th century, who again, similar to Anthony. So Seraphim ordained as a monk at age 15, and then spent 20 years in the monastery training. And then at age 35, entered into retreat for 30 years until he was 65 years old. And a lot of this retreat with the woods, the forest in northern Russia. And finally, at age 65, he claimed to have had experienced illumination and came out of retreat and taught the rest of his life, which was only 7 more years, only to be 72. But within those 7 years of teaching, he established himself as an extraordinary being, and is generally considered to be the greatest of the Russian saints. It's said that he had, for example, powers of clairvoyance, that people would come to visit him, and he would know ahead of time who was coming, about their history, would manifest himself to his disciples. He took one of his students out into a cold meadow in the snow, and then showed his radiance. He showed himself glowing with resplendent light rays. So again, it's hard to really know what this person was experiencing. But I think it definitely cannot be dismissed as simply a case of this is the wrong view or something like that. I think that these people were really experiencing something, either through their merit, or it's hard to say. And then Islam, which some of you know, is the, and so the most famous, we have Rumi. Some of you might have his famous poems, but there's a great tradition of uh,
Apologies, everyone. Venerable will be back in just a few seconds. Sorry. Hello. Please hold on a few seconds. Venerable will be back soon.
the chat. So
Yes, Venerable, you're back.
okay. So again, yeah, just let me know if you can't hear me, or I guess if anything else you need to let me know. So I was talking about
Uh,
yes. I was talking about the Sufis, but I'm going to move on to other Indian traditions. The next slide. I talked about Western traditions. Now, Indian traditions, as I said before, are closer to Buddhism in that their explicit purpose is to achieve liberation from samsara, which is very similar to Buddhism. So we have, first of all, the Jain tradition. Mahavira, some of you might know, was a great teacher of the Jains, who was a contemporary of the Buddha. He was born, I believe, about 40 years before the Buddha. And his teachings are still extant today. And within Jainism, it's explicit that the purpose of religious practice is to be free of the cycle of samsara, to achieve liberation. And likewise in the Upanishads. So some of you might know the Vedas, of course, the great Indian texts. And then we have commentaries on those. And then the commentaries to the commentaries to the commentaries are the Upanishads. So this was a way that people at about the time of the Buddha, starting about 200 years before the Buddha and continuing on until after he had taught, were trying to interpret the Vedas in a different way, understanding the hidden meaning. So the word Upanishad, as you'll see in this little caption I have here, it means to sit near, is one way to understand it, that one sits near the master and learns from him. But also another meaning of the word Upanishad is the secret meaning. And actually in Tibetan, this is how it's translated, Sangdön, the secret meaning. It's understood to be the secret meaning of the Vedas, the hidden meaning. That the explicit meaning teaching of the Vedas does not talk about how to meditate and be free of samsara. Actually, a lot of it talks about how to sacrifice animals and be free of cyclic existence. But in the Upanishads, it's understood to be an inner process to ultimately be free of ego and to achieve liberation. So a lot of people point out that this seems very similar to what the Buddha was saying. So it's a question, we debate these points and we ask, we point out flaws in these philosophies, which is considered a very good thing to do. It's important to discuss and show, okay, is there something wrong here that we can philosophically negate? But that doesn't necessarily mean it's hard to say what these people were really experiencing. Was it just an illusory kind of liberation, or is it possible that this was an alternative path? I don't have the answer, but this is the big question that comes up, especially with these other Indian religions. We have also the sage, in any case, this again, and this is these texts on value cognition are with the Samkhya's about their understanding of liberation. And then finally, we have Adi Shankara. Some of you might know, probably lived in about the 8th century. And a major difference between Adi Shankara and the previous teachers that I mentioned is that we don't actually have any Buddhist texts from India that I'm aware of that specifically argue with him. Because he lived a little bit too late. It's just as Buddhism was on the decline, often credited with did decline, that provided some very good reputations of Buddhists. And so this Buddhism in India, is that a lot of his teaching concepts, Buddhist extensively, Nagarjuna, Shantarakshi's teachings, other great Buddhists, and in some sense, he was the Okay, I'm here again. Yeah, just let me know if you missed anything. I was talking about yeah, everything is off, so we're doing the best we can here. But again, if you miss anything, you let me know. I was talking about Shankara and just mentioning that he had, read extensively in the works of Nagarjuna and of Shantirakshita and other Buddhist scholars. And so in a lot of ways, his philosophy, although it's based on the Vedic tradition, shares a lot in common, especially it seems with the mind-only school. In some sense, it seems like when Shankara talks about Ishvara or Shiva, the great deity, that his concept of it is very similar to the all-ground consciousness within the mind-only school. So it's hard to say that exactly what these practitioners, Shaivism, which is heavily based on his teachings, or Advaita Vedanta, the non-dual scholars of the Vedanta, of the Vedas. So this past year, when we were studying the teachings of Dharmakirti, the Buddhist scholar, we were talking about the way that he negated Vedas, philosophical. And I was discussing with some of my classmates and wondering if they had heard of it. One of my classmates, who's a scholar, very intelligent, good debater, had heard of him, though he said that it's not something that's Dharmakirti says, that he lived after Dharmakirti. My classmate was actually very interested. He really wanted to know what to say that he wasn't Buddhist or we don't agree with him. He did the Samkhya system, and there we also, by an extension, negate Shankara. He really wanted in February. He was actually okay. I'm here again. So I was saying my classmate, Sarah, was actually considering the Sanskrit University, Central Institute of Higher Tibetan Studies, which is in Swano, near Varanasi, and learn Sanskrit because he wanted to study Shankara's texts, which I think is a great example of an Alanda tradition, which is similar to the Socratic tradition. We say, follow the argument wherever leads. So and it's not enough just to hear, actually go and learn Sanskrit so that he could study tradition. As I mentioned, with these four Indian schools that I pointed out here, we have the Jain school, and then the Vedic school. I mean, the Vedic actually would mean a lot of different schools based on the Vedas, and then the Samkhya and the Vedanta system, which is heavily based on the Vedas, which are saying very similar things to Buddhism. It's very useful to consider what they're saying. It's not enough just to say that because we're Buddhist, we don't take this seriously. These people were serious philosophers and serious meditators, and some of them claimed to have found a path to liberation. If we have time, it's not that we should abandon our Buddhist studies, but it's generally recommended to spend about 1/3 of your time studying. If you have whatever amount of time you have studying, spend 2/3 of your time studying Buddhist texts and 1/3 studying other traditions and considering them in the light of that. So think about these things. So now I'll move on. Western philosophy we have. This is another school, another large body of knowledge. So I had Western religious traditions, but also we have Western philosophy, which has in some sense become separated. In India, there was not such a separation of religion and philosophy. And in the West, and originally that wasn't the case. But at first we have Plato, the great disciple of Socrates. So, we can see with the early philosophers like Plato and Aristotle that their traditions were also meditative traditions, especially with, say, Neoplatonism, the followers of Plato that arose later, were meditators. These were people trying to realize these things, not just through intellectual concepts, but through a direct experience. And Plato, as many of you know, might know, talked about the myth of the cave, that we're all locked. It's like, imagine people are locked into a cave and all they see is the shadows in the wall and they think this is real. But somebody might break free of the chains that keep them there and exit the cave and see the real world. And this is something that he said we should aspire for. Now, my personal feeling from having read Plato's philosophy is that it's very similar to the Indian philosophy of Vaisheshika, which is, a Vedic philosophy, which in Buddhism, again, we would say is actually wrong. It's pointing to something, but it's too reified. That Plato thought that, for example, behind the real world, there's an ideal world. There's a place where things exist in a non-manifest way. So, for example, we have a horse. There's something above and beyond all the horses in the world. There's some kind of ideal horse that manifests as these worldly horses. So in some sense, we'd say this is a kind of grasping at permanence. There's some kind of permanent self behind the changing appearance. And likewise, we have Descartes, the French philosopher who lived in the 16th century, who's often considered the father of the modern philosophy of mind. And Descartes, a lot of you might know, had the famous statement, "I think, therefore I am," which is something that he came up with, having focused on his mind and trying to understand who I really am. So we could say this is a kind of yoga. But Descartes very clearly stated that this self that I experience is the one real thing. And this self that I experience, it's permanent. It doesn't change. It's partless. And it is not based on any cause. It's simply inherently real. So it's quite interesting that Descartes said this, because this is exactly what Buddhist schools say. People come to the wrong view by clinging to inherent self. People who meditate, but without deep enough insight, strong enough concentration, or enough merit, they experience their inherent grasping at a self, and then they reify that, and they think that it, therefore, because I experience it this way, it must be permanent, unlike the changing world. It must be partless, unlike the world that is composed of this myriad, that is manifold. And it must be causeless, as opposed to the world that is constantly changing on the causes and conditions. So it's very clearly stated as a wrong view. But it's very interesting to see that Descartes, he came up with exactly the view that the Buddhists say people come up with when they don't understand properly. And also in Western philosophy, most philosophers today do not has imagining some kind of thing that's over and above what's actually experienced. But then we have two Western philosophers, Hume and Wittgenstein, you see here, who I think of all the Western philosophers in recent times, at least the past 500 years or so, seem to have the closest understanding to the Buddhist philosophy of emptiness. We're running out of too much time, but Hume specifically talked about the emptiness of the self, also about the example of the boat. I mentioned in my last talk that if we have a boat and then we repair, a wooden boat, and then every year you repair the boat by fixing one plank in the boat, eventually after some number of years, all the pieces of wood are going to be different than the original boat that was there. So is it a new boat, is the question. This comes up to our question of what is identity. So I think that this is very close to the Madhyamaka, the middle way understanding, that identity is a conventionality. And conventionally, we label it the same boat, but all the parts are changing. So we can't identify any particular part as constituting the identity of the boat. And likewise, Wittgenstein, his understanding of language and the way that our language constructs our experience of reality has often been compared to Chandrakirti's philosophy. But I think one of the drawbacks of Western philosophy, especially in recent times, is that it lacks a grounding in yogic practice. It's very much an intellectual endeavor. I can't say that these philosophies didn't influence these people's lives, but I think they didn't have a method for generating strong concentration, which is something that's really important for bringing this beyond the intellectual level into personal practice and actually experiencing emptiness the way that Nagarjuna talks about. So next we have modern saints. I have in quotations, not because I don't think these people are saintly, but just because I think saint is a Christian word. I think we talk about people who are understood or recognized by the rest of the world to have some kind of extraordinary level of development of human qualities, of compassion, of patience, of generosity. So I don't even need to name these people. I think you'll all know them. So I think this again becomes a question. You might ask, are these people what Buddhists would call bodhisattvas? And then secondly, even more deeply, are they some people who have realized emptiness? And I think in terms of the first question, are they bodhisattvas? My personal feeling, again, I can't prove this, is that, if anybody is a bodhisattva in the modern world, it's these people. So certainly there are, even though somebody might not manifest showing the view that we as Buddhists consider the right view, there definitely seem to be manifesting the qualities that we're aspiring to. And so I think we cannot just dismiss that. In terms of understanding of emptiness, that's a harder question. I think, at least in terms of the external appearance, it's hard to see from their philosophies that they had an understanding of the Buddhist topic of emptiness. But at the same time, I come back to what I said earlier, that we cannot judge another person. It's hard to really know what's going on in somebody's mind. But it is still important to recognize that, if we want to achieve liberation, even though we might not know what a person's level is, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't argue philosophically with them. So I would say that, philosophically, for example, with Gandhi, who I admire, of course, a great deal, who was a very philosophical person, still I would have some kind of disagreement with some of his philosophies. Not all of them, of course, but I think it's useful to think about that in terms of our own understanding. And I want to then contrast this with a quote from Dharmakirti, the great Buddhist philosopher, who said very clearly that love alone cannot bring liberation. So even if somebody has a great deal of cultivation of the human qualities of love and compassion, that alone cannot bring them to liberation, because for the reason he says here, love and such don't contradict confusion, and so they can't root out the greatest fault. All other faults are rooted in this one, and this is transient collection's view. So he's saying that when we say confusion, he says in the last line, transient collection's view, meaning the view of a personal self, the view that there's some kind of unchanging inherent self beyond the changing aggregates, the changing body and mind. This is the greatest confusion, the greatest fault. And simply cultivating great love and compassion, although it's very important and useful, it won't contradict that. It does not directly contradict that misunderstanding. And so it can't lead to full liberation. You can see this picture I have here. If you see the picture of a tree that's been cut. So all the branches are cut, but the root has not been cut. So it can still grow back. So this is the understanding of other forms of meditation that don't recognize emptiness. They can cut off the branches. They can cut down their afflictions to a very minimal level, but they can't cut out the root. Now, cutting off the branches is a very good accomplishment because it makes it a lot easier to cut off the root. But if we don't cut off the root and we just are reborn, it's possible that the afflictions could grow back. So we have to recognize that we still need to seek for the deeper view of emptiness. Now, also in this next slide, I want to point out Thomas Merton, the great Christian monk. One second. Okay. So yeah, I haven't seen anybody saying that you're lost, so I'm going to keep going. Just wanted to check on that. So Thomas Merton, a lot of you might know, was a Christian monk who lived from 1916 to 1968, so in the 20th century, and was a very famous author. His autobiography, especially, I believe it sold about 20 million copies. It was one of the best-selling books of the 20th century, and was very influential to me personally. Also, as a young person, I read some of his books, and it inspired me to become a monk, but not in the Christian tradition. And it's very interesting to see that in Thomas Merton's case, Thomas Merton was a very sincere Christian practitioner and tried very hard to go to the heart of Christian practice and mystical practice for him. That the questions he was asking, nobody could answer them. And he took an interest in Buddhism. He never gave up his Christian faith, but he took a very strong interest in both Buddhist philosophy and also Buddhist practitioners. And we see here the pictures of his journey to Asia. He took a trip to Asia to meet great masters. And unfortunately, he died suddenly. This picture of him with His Holiness the Dalai Lama on the left side was taken about 2 weeks before his sudden death. But His Holiness the Dalai Lama has commented that of all the Christians he's met in his life, it was Thomas Merton, and then also one great meditator in Spain, I believe, that he met, who made the greatest impression on him, who he really felt had some kind of inner experience. And Thomas Merton, and then on the right side, you have the picture here with Chajal Rinpoche, who was a Sakya Lama, who he met shortly after His Holiness. And he was so impressed by Chajal Rinpoche that he actually considered becoming his disciple and coming back and training under him. And they seemed to have a very natural connection. Now, after Thomas Merton left India, he traveled to Sri Lanka, as you'll see in the picture in the center below, to visit some of the holy sites in Sri Lanka. And I won't read through this whole quote that I have here because I don't know how choppy it will be, and we don't want to take up too much time. But you have this, so you can read through it. But basically, the point is that while he was visiting this site, I think Palanarua, it's called. I may not be pronouncing it right. In Sri Lanka, he had a very powerful experience, which he recorded in his journal, which is what I have put it here. And some people think that he had an experience of emptiness. He basically felt that after he had been searching for so long, what he'd been looking for revealed itself to him. He said the Asia in its purity, not covered over with garbage, that he'd been traveling through Asia, and although he'd expected to find an enlightened culture, he found a very poor culture, which is natural. There was a lot of poverty in India, but there's something behind that. There's something really worth searching for behind that, and he felt that he'd glimpsed that in in Sri Lanka. This was 6 days before his death. Then Merton, he traveled to Bangkok in Thailand, which was the ultimate destination of his journey, for an interfaith monastic conference, and then in his hotel room, unfortunately, was electrocuted by a faulty fan. But I think it's a very interesting sort of, riddle in some sense to look at his life and to see that ultimately he was drawn to Buddhism and to these teachings. And he never explicitly said, I don't believe in Christianity. I think it was more that he felt that what was missing was a living tradition, that in Buddhism there was still a living tradition of these great practitioners, which was something he was not finding at his monastery, which is in Kentucky in the US, that he felt that something had been lost in his tradition, where that had been preserved in certain Asian traditions. And it seems that maybe he found what he was looking for, and maybe at that point, it wasn't much use for him to be continuing with that life. Who knows? But if you have a chance to read about him, he's obviously an extraordinary writer, and gives a very good perspective on a lot of these questions. So next slide we have. Hold on a second. Have Ramana Maharshi, who I'm sure any of you from India will know, and a lot of you might know about him. I include him just because I think it's very interesting to see. A lot of people would say that of all the non-Buddhist masters of the last century, it definitely seems that this was somebody who seemed to be experiencing emptiness from the way he talked about it. Not just the way he talked about it, but the way he lived his life as a result. And we see this quotation from him. Who am I? Not the body, because it is decaying. Not the mind, because the brain will decay with the body. Not the personality nor the emotions, for these things also will vanish with death. Now, what somebody once suggested to me, which I thought was quite an interesting thing to consider, is that this Ramana Maharshi embodied what we call in Buddhism a self-realizer or a Pratyeka Buddha. This is basically somebody that, according to the Buddhist teachings, is somebody that learns the teachings from the Buddha or from a disciple of the Buddha, but then in a later lifetime is born somewhere where the teachings no longer exist. Now, generally, this is talked about as somewhere where the teachings have died out, but we can also consider, he was born in Southeast India in a time and place when there was no Buddhism extant. This was in the early 20th century. There was no real teachings of Buddhism to speak of that could be, or Buddhist masters that could be accessed. But simply by their own realization, at a very young age, he experienced some kind of profound illumination, which would be understood to be from the person's past cultivation in a past life. And we have Nagarjuna himself in his wisdom, he talks about this. When perfect Buddhas don't arise and hearers have all disappeared, the wisdom of self-realizers without a teacher blazes forth. So it's possible that some people in some places might have realizations without being particularly connected to a teacher or to a lineage, but simply through the force of their merit and through the force of their past cultivation in previous lifetimes. And then even the next slide we have, even many Buddhists fail to realize it. So we talk about emptiness, and as Buddhists, at least as Mahayana Buddhists, we all talk about emptiness, but that doesn't mean that we've necessarily experienced it. We have to be very careful about that. To say I'm a Buddhist and I understand and the other people don't understand. Even as Buddhists, it's very likely we are not really understanding what the Buddha meant when he talked about emptiness. And Chandrakirti, he himself talks about this in his supplement to the Middle Way, almost at the very end of the text. He says, I've told of suchness deep and fearful, those who trained in it before, certainly will realize it, but others, though they've heard much, won't internalize. So what he's saying is that essentially people who have imprints from past lives will be able to understand emptiness. People who have not cultivated this in a past life, no matter how much they study, they won't have a realization of emptiness. And this doesn't mean that nobody should put effort. You have to start somewhere. But it's saying that this is something that takes a lot of cultivation over many lifetimes. And so even many Buddhists, even though they become great scholars and understand intellectually very clearly, they still might fail to realize the ultimate teaching of the Buddha, the teaching on emptiness. And actually, Chandrakirti, in his auto-commentary to this verse, he explicitly names some scholars. It almost seems a little bit politically incorrect to do so, but maybe it's useful for us to reflect on. He names three famous Indian pandits or panditas, Vasubandhu, Dignaga, and Dharmapala, and says that these people, although they were great scholars, they failed to realize the teaching of the Buddha, the teaching on emptiness. And Vasubandhu, many of you will know, was a great polymath. He was a master of many different disciplines within Buddhism, the Abhidharma tradition, the mind-only tradition. He traveled to many different universities and mastered their teachings, and often was able to then use that against them. In Kashmir, at a great university, he studied and then wrote a text which was renowned as the greatest exposition of their school. And then they asked him to write an auto-commentary to that text, which he did. And in the auto-commentary, he then negated everything he'd said. So he showed that not only did he understand their teaching, but he knew why it was wrong. But nevertheless, it's understood that in terms of the final teaching on emptiness, he did not understand. He did not have the final view. And then Dignaga, who was actually a student of Vasubandhu, who was renowned as the father of Buddhist logic. And in Tibetan monasteries, we revere him. We study his texts, and especially Dharmakirti's texts, which are commentaries on Dignaca's texts. And he's put on the altar and prostrated to and considered a great lineage master. But it's understood that he did not understand emptiness at the deepest level. And then finally, we have Dharmapala, who actually in Tibet was not very much studied. Actually, I don't think many of his texts were translated into Tibetan, which is why, as you see from this statue of him, it's actually, as you can tell from the features, it was made in China, because Dharmapala actually was more extent his teachings in China. He was actually considered one of the lineage masters of the Chan, or the Zen lineage. But according to Chandrakirti, who lived about 100 years after him, Dharmapala had been the abbot of Nalanda before Chandrakirti. Chandrakirti felt that he also had not understood the final teaching, because Dharmapala was also a scholar of the mind-only school. He was not a middle-way philosopher. Next, we have East Asian masters. So I wanted to, as I said, about different Buddhist traditions, and ask, are people in different Buddhist traditions experiencing emptiness? Now, here are 3 East Asian masters who, at least from my, examination, not that I'm somebody to take as an authority on this matter, but my own personal feeling from studying is that these were 3 masters who probably did experience emptiness, if anybody did in East Asia, and I'm sure somebody must have. So we first have Huineng, who some of you might know was considered the 6th patriarch of the Chan, or the Zen, as it's called in Japanese, lineage, who was not a great scholar. He was actually a cook in the kitchen, but due to his past imprint, simply by hearing somebody recite the Diamond Cutter Sutra, he had an experience of emptiness. And then he was named by the abbot of the monastery as the next patriarch, much to the surprise of the closer students. They named the cook as the next patriarch, based on his realization. And then we have Dogen, the great Japanese practitioner who traveled to China to learn the teachings, and after many years claimed to have experienced emptiness. So this is again what I want to emphasize, that it's not just something that happens randomly. In Huineng's case, maybe he had very, very strong imprints, but in Dogen's case, it's something that comes to great cultivation. And then finally, in Haikun, another Japanese master, who was very explicit that he took many, many years from him. It's not just something that comes flexing into the nature of the mind, as some people even today, have this view that we shouldn't push too hard. We have to be careful not to overwhelm ourselves, but spiritual practice takes a lot of cultivation. As you see in his 41st year, he says, I at long last penetrate very similar to some of what's happening in the world today with forms of nowadays that you don't need to do, and be yourself and accept who you are. Practice contentment, which I think actually a bit of a misunderstanding. Talked about contentment, but the Buddha said we should be content with our external. We don't want to better car, better job, all these things, more money. But we don't want to be content with the state of our mind. We don't just want to say, oh, my mind's a mess, it's no big deal. That's just who I am, I'll accept it. We actually want to put a lot of effort into okay. I'm hearing was in century Japan. In some sense, we're very similar to what we're dealing with today, with different popular forms of Buddhism. So Haikun said, or this, sorry, he didn't say, but this is a quote about him. One of Haikun's major concerns was the danger of what he called do-nothing Zen teachers, who upon reaching some small experience of enlightenment, devoted the rest of their life to, as he puts it, passing day after day in a state of seated sleep. Quietist practices seeking simply to empty the mind, or teachers who taught that a tranquil emptiness was enlightenment, were Haikun's constant targets. In this regard, he was especially critical of the followers of the maverick Zen master Bankai. He stressed a never-ending and severe training to deepen the insight of enlightenment and forge one's ability to manifest in all activities. He urged his students never to be satisfied with shallow attainments, and surely believed that enlightenment was possible for anyone if they exerted themselves and approached their practice with real energy. So I want to stop here for now. I have a little bit more. This was my introductory talk. In the afternoon, I'll start with actually talking about Nagarjuna's text, the 60 stanzas. But I wanted to give a lot of background because, as I said, the teaching on Nagarjuna's teaching, his teaching is about why we need to realize emptiness, and that we cannot have enlightenment or liberation without that. So I wanted to examine different people in different places, who claim to be experiencing some kind of illumination, and look at it in that context. Now, I didn't completely finish the introductory talks. In the afternoon, I'll talk a little bit about Southeast Asian masters, and also about other Tibetan masters, and then about Mahayana versus Hinayana, and then we'll get into the actual talk about Nagarjuna's text. Now, when I did the 70 stanzas, as you recall, I only went through some of the stanzas because the text was just so dense. It was not going to be possible in 2 days to go through every verse. But in the 60 stanzas, it's a little bit more comprehensible. So I'm going to try to go through all 60 stanzas. I'm hoping in 3 sessions this afternoon and then 2 tomorrow. We can do 20 stanzas per session. But now, if we could have maybe a few questions. I think it'll be hard for people to ask live, but people can type questions. And this will also just give me an idea of where you are at. So people, if you either have questions or want to make any comments about things that you found confusing or helpful, that would also help me to think about how I frame the following talks. So somebody asked about the fundamental difference from Adi Shankara, Vedanta, and Buddhism. So I have to say, I don't know. I mentioned about my classmate, who I was very impressed by, who wants to go to study Sanskrit and learn about Shankara. And I was very intrigued from reading about him. But I have not read a lot about his actual text. As I mentioned, none of it is translated into Tibetan. And there's no mention of him in any of the Tibetan texts. My point was that I think of all the Indian masters, non-Buddhist masters that I've read about, he's the one who intrigues me most as somebody who may have had some understanding of emptiness outside of the Buddhist tradition. Now, if anybody of you has any recommendations for books, not just primary sources, but books about his philosophy, I would actually be interested to know about them, because I will read them. But actually, I should mention, I think the real thing that Shankara, he does talk about a creator God, about Ishvara or Shiva. But as I said, his understanding of the creator God is very different. It's not like this very simplistic idea of somebody in the sky who just made the world. It's more about an underlying principle of reality, the nature of the mind, which I said is very similar to the mind-only school idea of the ground, all-ground consciousness. Now here we have the question, is realizing emptiness and enlightenment the same? That's a very important question, and no, it's not the same. But it's the path to enlightenment. So it said when we realize emptiness, first we have a conceptual realization, and with that we can thereby meditate and eventually have a direct perception of emptiness. Now, I think in the Zen tradition, it seems that they consider this direct perception of emptiness, they called it with the word enlightenment, but that doesn't mean it's the same as the actual Buddhahood that we're aiming for. So then once somebody has this direct perception, they have to meditate on that again for a very long time to achieve enlightenment. But it's like without even having that, you're not getting anywhere. The first step, as it's often called, is what we call stream entry. It's like you enter into the stream that's going to lead you to the ocean. That stream is the realization of emptiness, and you're going to get there. Once you're in the stream, you're definitely going to get there. But if you don't even get to the stream, there's not even any question about reaching the ocean. So the definition of emptiness, basically it's different schools have different ways of understanding it, but the way I'll define it, based on Chandrakirti's understanding of Nagarjuna's school, it's the lack of, when we search among the basis of designation for something, we do not find anything that is that thing, or that's the referent for the term. Get a little bit more clarified as I go through Nagarjuna's text. That, as I said, I've given a lot of background. Within the text, I'll actually talk about his understanding of emptiness. But also, I mentioned that I taught an earlier course on the 70 stanzas. This course was more specifically about emptiness, and not just about what does it mean to realize emptiness. So if you were interested, we could provide you with a recording for that, because I think make it more clear. Emptiness, in many ways, to misunderstand it. And emptiness is not understand it that we reality and go into some kind. Emptiness is talking about the way things exist. For example, if we have a painting, Shiva, is somebody, this is a kind of either Vishnu or Shiva. I was saying that somebody else might say this is neither Vishnu nor Shiva, it's only a painting. This painting not being Vishnu is the emptiness of the painting. Oh, sorry, the painting not being Shiva. It's a painting as Shiva, but it's not really Shiva. So that is the emptiness of being Shiva. It's not like there's some other thing that we can find other than the painting, but it's emptiness. So in English, we have the term emptiness. It implies like a lack of something not existing in a place. So like this room is empty of cats. There's no cats in this room. But actually in both Tibetan and Sanskrit, it can also function in a copular sense. So copular means to be something. So I am a monk. I am a man. I am not a woman. So I'm empty of being a woman. It doesn't have to do with having something. Like I don't have a daughter has to do with possession. But saying I am not a woman has to do with lack of being something. So emptiness in this sense has to do with not being a particular thing. So you're saying that the audio was not so good. I apologize for that. But I hope you heard my saying that if you really want to get more into it, the last course I taught on the 70 stanzas was much more about the actual definition of emptiness. So if we can get you a recording of that, but also that in terms of this course, as we go through the stanzas, the 60 stanzas, that will be, it'll become more clear what we're talking about. This talk was more about background. So then, okay, a couple other questions. One other question: did the mind-only masters not attain enlightenment? Is Madhyamaka philosophy the only way to attain enlightenment? So this comes back to what I said earlier, that philosophically, at least according, of course, to the Madhyamaka school, this is the correct view. However, the question is, even if somebody doesn't have the correct philosophical view, could they experience enlightenment simply by the strength of their merit? And this seems to be a little bit of what Kejip and also Lama Zopa Rinpoche are hinting at. So it's a very difficult question. And it also, there's the question of, even, sometimes there's the analogy of like digging for water. If you want to dig a well, you have to keep digging in one place to get to water. If you keep digging many small holes, you won't get anywhere. So some people might have the idea that, if we follow the Madhyamaka system, we'll get to the water. If we dig another hole in a different place, like the mind-only school, we still might get to the water. But we can't just keep switching back and forth. We have to focus on the one we're in. So whether that's the case, that they both lead to water or not, I really don't have an answer. The general presentation is that that's not the case. But it's very hard to say. But I think it's very important to recognize that even if somebody might seem to be enlightened, an example that's sometimes given is that if you're standing at the beginning of a racetrack and you see two people very far down the track, they might seem to be close to each other, but from your perspective. But actually, one of them is much farther away than the other one. So likewise, enlightenment is a very, very advanced spiritual state. So although somebody from our perspective might seem to be very advanced, it may not be that they're all the way there. And there might be somebody who's much farther along. So it might be that the Madhyamaka philosophers are more advanced. That's at least how it is presented. But as I said, until I have personal experience of that, I cannot verify it. How do I answer Thai Buddhists who say becoming a Buddha is impossible for them, and your aim is for a fortunate rebirth? So generally, in terms of Thai Buddhism, actually, I'll talk about that immediately in the afternoon. That's the next slide. But the question of if becoming a Buddha is impossible and then their aim is for a fortunate rebirth, I think on one level, we have to recognize that for most of us, we are not going to be enlightened in this life. Unless we have extraordinary imprints, it's very hard to do that. So we don't want to have an unrealistic expectation. I'm going to get enlightened in a 3-year retreat. And we have to think about what's going to happen in my next life, such that I can lay the groundwork. But at the same time, we don't want to go to the extreme of saying, I can't get enlightened, and therefore I should just pray to be born in a better place and not make any effort. We have to start where we are. And if we make effort, eventually we can get there. And His Holiness the Dalai Lama often mentions this, that this can be a bit of a problem in Buddhist cultures, where Buddhism is just the cultural religion that people then adopt it as, this is just something I believe in, that I'll just pray and be a good person and make offerings to the temple, but not really understand, seek to understand it because I can't, it's too hard. I think that's not the point, that anyone, if they want to make some effort, they can get somewhere. And so we definitely should put some effort into what we can do, what we can learn, what we can have realization of. So not be unrealistic, but also not be too fatalistic. Have some kind of sense of I can do something. I have Buddha nature. It's possible for me. Okay, so I think we're already a little over time. So thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have Wi-Fi here. We're in quarantine, and we're a bit limited in what we can do. I was thinking of to go on the roof to teach, but the problem is that the director of the quarantine might come and scold me because we're not supposed to leave our rooms. So we'll do the best we can. I apologize for the technical difficulties. So we'll have a break now. And also, if you have questions, we'll do the best we can to address them in these talks. But also, I think it's good we can have an online forum after the teaching finishes, such that I can address questions by email that will be a lot clearer without any of the technical difficulties. So if you have big questions, please save them up. And if you don't have a chance to ask them, you can write and we'll have a forum where I can present them. But we'll see you all at 2 o'clock Indian time. So hope you have a nice lunch or wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is. See you all soon. So thank you very much. Oh, and before we leave, we should just do a short dedication. We'll have a more dedication in the afternoon. But let's just dedicate the merit for all the people who are suffering in the world now. A lot of people suffering of the virus and the related issues, and also just people suffering from being in samsara. And dedicate that all of us might eventually realize emptiness, as Nagarjuna talks about, such that we might also be able to be of incredible benefit to the entire world, like all the past enlightened beings have been. Thank you very much. See you in a couple hours.